Okay, so I'll get started in English. And let me start with a bit of history. So what you're seeing here is actually the first ever scientific journal published back in the year 1665. And this journal published in just about any area you can imagine. So if you were a scientist back then looking for relevant knowledge, this would be the place to go. But if you're doing this in the year of 2022, you'll use a scientific search engine. And you're much more likely to come up with this, a whirlwind of research papers and millions of authors. Now, this has some serious impacts on science. First, it creates information overload, making it hard to keep track, and I'm sure we can all identify with that. This creates inefficient knowledge sharing and discovery, which creates these isolated silos of scientific knowledge. And the more isolated these silos get, the harder and harder it is to share and discover knowledge. So this kind of vicious cycle leads to a research tunnel vision, an inwardly focused scientific culture. So science is becoming overwhelmingly fragmented, and it's increasingly hard to discover ideas outside our so-called bubbles. And this is a problem because breakthroughs often emerge precisely from building these connections across ideas. Think, for example, of neural networks, reinforcement learning, genetic algorithms, quantum computing, all of these big ideas directly inspired by other areas of science. Now, they don't have to come from completely disparate areas. So you could be in the graph neural network community, for example, and get inspiration from graph theory. Or you could be in machine learning and get inspirations from statistics. And this, of course, does happen from time to time, but it's becoming increasingly difficult. So this raises the question of what opportunities and inspirations and breakthroughs are we currently missing outside our bubbles? And can computational approaches help us find these things? So my vision is to build these computational approaches that harness our collective scientific knowledge that's embedded in the scholarly literature to augment and scale scientific discovery. Looking at the literature not so much as a pile of papers where we dump all our ideas and findings, but more like a database of scientific problems, solutions, and directions that can be leveraged to help scientists come up with new ideas, new inspirations, new methods you can try for the problems you work on, or new problems where you can apply your methods. Automatically generate scientific hypotheses based on this database of problems, solutions, and directions, and automatically build connections across diverse areas of science. Now, that's the big vision, but there are some fundamental challenges on the way. First, the literature is large-scale and highly unstructured, with complex ideas described in complex language. Secondly, another kind of important dimension for this complexity is just the huge space of hypotheses you can explore in science. Think about all the different directions you can explore for all the different problems out there in science. An application area I've recently been working on is in drug discovery, where we have these huge combinatorial spaces of things like compounds, diseases, genes, proteins, and we want to predict missing links in these huge spaces. But still, our current way as scientists for interacting with all this wealth and complexity is very limited. In particular, most of us interact with the literature via standard keyword search engines, where we get back long lists of results, long lists of paper entries, making it very hard to discover connections across the literature and discover new insights. And finally, an important point is that underlying all of this is the fact that science is a human process with social and cognitive biases that dictate what we work on, who we work with, who we cite. And this, of course, propagates down to those search engines that filter our knowledge. So my research agenda is to attack all these challenges under the frame of what I call computational scientific discovery. I build new paradigms for searching, recommending, exploring, and discovering scientific knowledge. I do this by developing novel approaches for search and discovery with new methods in information retrieval, information extraction, data mining, and human-computer interaction. And to support these new approaches, I also often explore new AI settings and models in areas like weak supervision, automatic knowledge graph construction, link prediction, and textual matching. And in this talk, I'll discuss some work touching on both of these themes. First, I'll tell you about a new type of search capability that we built to help you find inspirations with analogies. Think of a new search engine where you can get creative solutions and new perspectives for problems. I'll then move on, take this a step forward, and help you find authors who make you think of new ideas outside your research bubbles, so you can actually make these connections between people in different areas. And then in terms of new technical capabilities that we build, I'll show you a new task and models that we built for learning to link across diverse language in diverse scientific communities, using different language to describe what is often similar concepts. And then I'll end with some future work. Okay, let's start with analogies. So being able to perform analogical mapping and abstraction of problems, these are core skills of human creativity, studied for many years in cognitive psychology. All the way back to the ancient Greeks, who studied sound by analogy to the water they could observe. The Wright brothers taking ideas from bicycles to innovate in flight. NASA designing spacecraft with analogies to origami design. And in our field, as I said earlier, we have neural networks or genetic algorithms as examples of ideas directly inspired by other areas. I also wanted to share some random analogy I recently spotted in a recent NeurIPS paper, where the author says that they explicitly use an analogy between these transformer neural networks and dynamical systems of interacting particles. But my goal is to help inventors and researchers automatically find these kind of analogical inspirations and abstract connections so we can do better science and be more creative. But of course, this kind of analogy is extremely difficult to find. And one fundamental reason is that it requires the ability to identify abstract structural similarity between things as far apart as neural network architectures and interacting particles in physics. And this is extremely hard for machines to do at the moment. NLP and information retrieval methods do especially well at surface similarity, when things are very relevant to your original query, but not diverse and lacking in novelty and abstraction. So if, for example, you are searching in your favorite scientific search engine for transformer model training, you're not going to get back interacting particles in physics. Now, in the previous work in a kind of small niche domain called computational analogy, people created these handcrafted databases with high abstract relational structures that can help us find these kind of abstract connections. So for example, what you see here on the right is these structures used for mapping between the solar system and the model of the atom. Now, this is a really nice example of an analogy, but of course, this kind of structure is completely infeasible to obtain at scale across all the wealth and complexity of scientific papers, for example.
אבל פה, אפשר לשאול?
כן, בטח.
פה דווקא NLP אולי היה עוד מוצא את זה, כי נגיד מה שמשותף עם זה המילה אורביט, וזו מילה שלא משתמשים בה בהרבה הקשרים אחרים.
אוקיי, אז קודם כל אפשר לחשוב על English, Hebrew בתשובות. אפשר לחשוב על המילה אורביט כמשהו שכנראה הגיע אחרי שכבר חשבו על הקשר הזה, זה אחד. שתיים, יש פה הרבה תכונות שצריך לעשות להם אבסטרקציה, כי NLP, יש הרבה דברים שהזכירו את המילה אורביט, אבל יש פה מבנה מסוים שמנסים למצוא למפות, ו-NLP לא יודע לזהות מה המבנה שבדיוק אנחנו מחפשים. So how do we make progress toward this really fundamental challenge? Well, my key insight in this work was that we can learn to decompose ideas into these weaker structural representations. Representations that, on the one hand, are expressive enough for finding these kind of analogies, but also easy enough to be learned automatically and extracted from texts. And then, based on these structural representations, we can then perform alignment between them so we can find these analogies. Now, a key structure we focus on in this work is a schema studied in cognitive psychology in the context of how people reason in terms of analogies when they perform creative problem solving. And this schema is of purposes and mechanisms, what things do and how they do them. So our first goal is going to be to extract these purposes and mechanisms automatically so we can leverage them to find analogies. And to do that, we first collect the data set. We collect annotations of purposes and mechanisms from texts that describe ideas. For example, technological products like patents and scientific papers. Now, in our first work, we demonstrated our methods and concepts in the domain of technological products, and then we moved on to scientific papers. I'll show you both, starting with products. So let's take, for example, this description of a technological pillow. We crowdsourced for annotations of mechanisms, what you see over here, these spans of text corresponding to all kinds of mechanisms, like all kinds of sensors embedded in the pillow. And then we also have purposes, like improving and monitoring your sleep or supporting your sleep. We collect these annotations automatically using crowdsourcing across many descriptions of products. And then we train information extraction models in NLP to extract these purposes and mechanisms from descriptions of text. And we do this with all kinds of customized models that we built for this task, which I'm not going to be discussing today. But the key thing to keep in mind is that given an input description of a product, we can now go to purposes and mechanisms at the output. And now where it gets interesting is, based on this representation of purposes and mechanisms, we can now look at products as these sets of vectors or embeddings of these purpose spans and mechanism spans. We have these spans of text and we have vector representations for them. For example, using outputs from our models or from neural language models, neural language embedding models. And based on these sets of purposes and mechanisms, we can now perform something that in cognitive psychology was called analogical retrieval. And in this work, I formulated analogical retrieval computationally as follows. We are given a database of ideas and their textual descriptions, for example, products or papers. We're also given some seed or query idea, like a specific product or paper that we are interested in. We also have distance measures that we formulate between sets of purposes and mechanisms for the given query and for all candidates in our database. And now, based on these distance measures, we can issue queries to our database. For example, we can find two products or two ideas that share similar purposes, but have very different mechanisms. Or we can find ideas that have similar mechanisms, but far purposes, which is also known in science and engineering as repurposing, taking a mechanism originally intended for one purpose and repurposing it for a completely different one. Now, to make this a bit more tangible, let's go back to our technological pillow. Let's say we work for a company that produces these devices, and we want to find new purposes for our technologies or new mechanisms we can bring in to make our device better. So let's overlay our description of the pillow with purposes and mechanisms automatically extracted. We can now retrieve all kinds of partial structural matches, conditioning on certain aspects while enforcing distance along others. So for example, we can find a robotic neck brace, which is a very different way for supporting your neck, different than the original pillow product. Or we can find a car seat vital signs monitor, which also has sensors embedded inside soft material, very different than the original pillow, but bearing some structural similarity. And these could provide us with new inspirations for new markets or new technologies we can bring in to make our device better. Now, a second thing we do with these purposes and mechanisms is to learn hierarchies across the corpus of ideas. And we can learn these hierarchies, and in a moment I'll tell you how, that help us reflect problem abstractions. So, concrete example, let's say I am a designer working on a problem in charging smartphones, and I want to find new inspirations for this. So we can traverse this automatically constructed graph and land in areas we may not have considered, like solar power or mechanical stored energy to charge our smartphones. So how do we build this graph? I just told you we present ideas in terms of sets of purposes and mechanisms and their vector representations. How do we go from that to building this kind of graph? Well, in a nutshell, we first extract this representation of purposes and mechanisms across the entire corpus. We then perform corpus-wide clustering of these purpose and mechanism vectors, finding cohesive subsets of, for example, mechanisms like solar power and sustainable energy. And given that we have this discrete representation, we can now go back to products and represent them as sets of clusters for problems or purposes and sets of clusters for mechanisms. And then we can compute the empirical probability of seeing one problem cluster given another. And we can also look at the other direction. So we can, for example, infer that when you see the problem of charging battery, you often also see the problem of generating power, but it doesn't work in the other direction because generating power is a much more general problem than just charging batteries. And this can help us infer the direction of the hierarchy. And of course, we can also condition on seeing a certain problem and what's the probability of seeing that mechanism associated with that problem. And this is how we build our graph of abstraction, connecting different levels of hierarchy for problems and mechanisms. So I described these two core capabilities of analogical retrieval and this graph of problem abstractions. How do we evaluate these things? I'll tell you about, yes.
שאלה קצרה, אני רואה איך במוצרים אפשר לעשות יותר, אני לא רואה במאמרים מדעיים, Crowdsourcing, נכון, אני רואה לחלוטין איך אתה יכול להוריד מאמזון או מאיביי את Product Reviews ולקבל את זה, דברים דומים עם Sentiment Analysis, אבל דיברת על מאמרים מדעיים, יש לי בעיה לחבר את המוטיבציה בהתחלת ההרצאה למוטיבציה.
בסדר גמור. אז א', עוד כמה שקפים אני אראה את זה במאמרים מדעיים, אבל רק חשוב לומר שההיבט של ה-Crowdsourcing רק כדי יצירת טריינינג סט ראשוני, ואז מפעילים מודלים שמוציאים את זה על כל שאר המאמרים. וגם במאמרים מדעיים עשינו Crowdsourcing, ובאופן אולי קצת מפתיע, זה עובד לא רק, כי מתלבשים על כל מיני דפוסים סינטקטיים, שיכולים להצביע על שמשהו משמש למשהו, בלי שבאמת מבינים בהכרח מה. יש עבודות אחרות שאני לא אראה פה, עבודות שלנו, שבהם אנחנו הולכים מומחים, שאוספים את הדברים האלה, את התיוגים האלה, ואז זה הרבה יותר מדויק. Okay, so one of the main ways we evaluate is with retrieval accuracy. We collect human relevance ratings for these kind of search results. For example, we give people queries that involve repurposing. Like we give people queries that take the mechanism of light and repurposing that mechanism away from the purpose of generating light. And one of the examples we retrieve, just to make it concrete, is a UV light sanitizer, where now the purpose of light is cleaning. A second example is the mechanism of water repurposed away from drinking and cleaning. And then, for example, we retrieve hydrogen fuel cells, where now the purpose of water is generating energy. So we give all these queries and results to human raters. We measure with all kinds of standard information retrieval metrics that compare the ranking from the retrieval model to the human relevance labels. And the bottom line is that our approach is able to do substantially better than standard retrieval for this kind of analogical queries. Now, the second way we evaluate, and the most important one, is in terms of utility. How do we use this to make people more creative? And we do this in the context of ideation studies, these fundamental methodologies in psychology and engineering for evaluating creativity. For example, we give participants in our study the task of redesigning a product, finding new ways to solve a problem. For example, we give them a case that charges your cell phone, and we ask them to come up with new ways to charge your cell phone. And then we show participants in these ideation studies inspirations. For example, inspirations from standard search, like what they would get on Google, all kinds of things like cases and cell phone batteries, very relevant, but not diverse and lacking in this kind of abstract structural connection we're interested in. And then with our approach, we're interested in finding things that have far mechanisms, but near purposes, because we're looking for new ways to solve the same problem. And then we first see that we retrieve things related to charging, but not related to phones. In particular, one of the examples we retrieved was this kind of suit that generates power using your movement. And when you think about it, the purpose of the suit is indeed to generate power, and the mechanism is far from a phone case. So when people in our studies viewed this specific inspiration that we retrieved, they tended to come up with ideas for powering your phone using kinetic energy while you're walking. So to make this more quantitative, we gave all these ideas generated to a panel of people with technical backgrounds who rated according to standard protocol in ideation studies, metrics like novelty, quality, and feasibility. And then we measured the proportion of ideas that were considered positive or essentially good ideas according to all these metrics. And we first see that our approach based on analogical retrieval of inspirations is able to make the quality of ideas dramatically better than inspiration surfaced by standard search. To evaluate that graph, we also conducted a similar kind of ideation study where we asked people to tell us if these inspirations are considered both useful and novel for solving a problem creatively. And again, we see that our approach based on analogies is able to do substantially better than all kinds of information retrieval and NLP approaches. So the kind of core takeaway here is that we were able to boost the ability of people to be more creative. One of our main results is that we see an up to twofold increase in ideas that are considered both useful and novel with respect to baselines in strong information retrieval and standard search engines. Now, also to Ishai's question about science. So we also worked with the Biomechanical Engineering research group. And this group was interested in finding all kinds of novel structures based on polymer stretching and folding. And they were looking for new applications and new techniques outside their area of expertise. They wanted to branch out and find all kinds of areas where this kind of expertise can be useful. But they quickly hit a wall with Google Scholar because they kept finding things that they are already familiar with or very similar to what they are familiar with. But with our approach based on analogical retrieval, we took in their papers, like abstracts, for example. We extracted the purposes and mechanisms via crowdsourcing, by the way, which worked reasonably well. If you can just complete sorry. And then we find ideas or papers with similar purposes, but far mechanisms, for example, or similar mechanisms and far purposes, depending on the context. And they were able to find all kinds of things like computational geometry simulation models, or even studies in civil engineering for crippling and folding of steel beams, which is related in an abstract way to stretching and folding. And the experts considered these inspirations as helping them think of alternative approaches and models that they would not have considered both useful and novel for their domain, more than what they got from Google Scholar, of course, in blind studies. Question?
When we say we extract it, automatically extract it.
Yes, automatically extract it.
Semi-automatically, we use exactly the same mechanism we use for the phone charger. Apply to
For the what?
exactly for the phone charger, the iPhone charger use exactly the same mechanism for the scientific papers. Or your handcrafted just what do you mean? Say we.
Okay, very similar mechanism, was a different paper, but very similar with an appropriate level of abstraction. It's exactly similar. We train information extraction models, fully automatic, to extract purposes and mechanisms from text. So the model is pretty similar.
But again, you need to know the context. So it's you, some researcher see the context, use the previously developed tool and apply it to the. You're trying to understand. I mean, you don't know like what I'm asking you. When you do this adaptation, it's not the case that some human intelligence is involved and actually you help finding the right abstraction.
No.
Rather than so this what can you elaborate? What is this? You say same approach. What does it mean?
The same approach? Yeah.
In what sense? Yes.
Yeah, sure. So to clarify, the same approach means we extract structural representations of purposes and mechanisms. So we extract these spans of text. Yes, the input is the text. It's the text of an abstract in this case.
In both scenarios.
Yes. Yes.
מנגנון extraction, אני מניח שהוא אחר. כלומר, המילים שאתה מחפש, הפאטרנס שאתה מחפש, יהיו אחרים במוצרים ובמאמרים.
אבל זה מאומן אוטומטית עם מודלים שמקבלים כאינפוט טקסט. יש להם annotations לספנים של הטקסט.
הנוטיישן הם אותם הנוטיישנס או הנוטיישן שונים?
הנוטיישנס הם ל-purposes ו-mechanisms בשני המקרים.
אותם הנוטיישן.
כן, הוספנו גם במאמרים מדעיים annotations ל-background ול-results.
השפה היא קצת שונה, אבל זה עדיין קל לזהות את זה, ויש הרבה מאמרים שיש בהם סעיף של מתודס, או מופיע מתודס בתוך האפס, אתה יכול לזהות את זה, המילה מתודס לא...
לצורך העניין, אני לא מעשיתי אדפטציה לפרית, לצורך העניין, אם עכשיו ניתן לך תחום אחר לגמרי, אתה לא צריך לעשות כלום. אתה עשית שינוי למאמרים מדעיים, עכשיו ניתן לך תחום אחר של מאמרים מדעיים, תעשו נורא ג'נרטורס, אתה תכניס את זה אותו כלי, וניתן לך המלצות, אתה חושב שינוי סבירות.
לא.
לא.
כן, כי צריך לאסוף, בהרבה מקרים צריך לאסוף דאטה בתוך הדומיין, תיוגים חדשים ל-purposes ו-mechanisms, כדי לאמן את המודלים האלה, להוציא את זה אוטומטית מתוך טקסטים.
זה crowdsourcing.
crowdsourcing לדוגמה, או תיוגים של מומחים. כן, אבל בהרבה עבודות אחרות שאני לא מראה פה היום, אני מתמקד באופן כללי במבנים אבסטרקטיים כאלה שמוכללים על הרבה מאמרים מדעיים. בהרבה בתחומים במדע יש purposes ו-mechanisms. בעצם זה מין building block מאוד יסודי כזה של איך שאנחנו חושבים. יש לי עוד כל מיני סכמות כאלה, שאני פחות הולך לדבר עליהם היום, אבל באופן כללי הרבה מהדברים האלה מוכללים על הרבה מאמרים מדעיים. אז נגיד אני מראה בחלק מהעבודות שאני יכול לאמן על מאמרים בקוביד, ואז להפעיל את זה על מדעי המחשב ולקבל תוצאות טובות. כן, as is zero shot generalization, אבל מן הסתם האיכות יורדת קצת מבחינת הדיוק, כי זה לא בדיוק באותו דומיין, אבל אם היינו אוספים עוד תיוגים בתוך הדומיין הספציפי זה היה משתפר, בכל זאת יש כל מיני clues סינטקטיים שונים שצריך לעלות עליהם, אבל בגדול המבנים האלה מאוד מתאימים להרבה דומיינים והרבה schools of thought במדע בעצם. זה עוזר לענות על זה? אוקיי, יופי.
רגע, אפשר לשאול שאלה?
כן, בטח.
דיברת עכשיו על קשר בין קוביד למדעי המחשב נגיד?
כן.
אז מלכתחילה היה לכם רעיון שקוביד ומדעי המחשב יכול להתקשר, ואז עשיתם את הקולקשן שלכם על שני התחומים ובדקתם קשרים, או שסתם אספתם על כל מיני תחומים ואז גיליתם להפתעתכם שיש קשרים בין קוביד ומדעי המחשב?
לא, היה רעיון מלכתחילה שהמבנים האלה הם אבסטרקטיים, חוזרים על עצמם בכל תחומי המדע או ברובם, בעיקר במדעים הטבעיים והניסויים, ושזה מאוד הגיוני שזה יקרה, וספציפית מאמרים בקוביד דווקא, אני פחות מדבר על זה היום שוב, אבל הם מאוד רב-תחומיים. יש שם הרבה מאוד טקסטים שקשורים באמת לאלגוריתמים שמשתמשים בהם, אבל גם הרבה מאמרים בפיזיקה ומכימיה ומתמטיקה, כמובן ביולוגיה. אז הדומיין הזה ספציפית הוא גם מאפשר לאמן מודלים שמוכללים טוב להרבה סוגים שונים של מאמרים מדעיים.
ובדקתם, על איזה סוגים של דומיינס בדקתם את הכלים שלכם? נגיד רק על מדעי הטבע, או נגיד אפילו על מדעי הרוח והחברה?
זו שאלה טובה. אז שם אני חושב שיכול להיות שיש פחות עיסוק נגיד purposes ו-mechanisms, זה יכול להיות ששם הסכמה צריכה להיות שונה. למרות שבמדעי החברה נגיד, בכלכלה לדוגמה, אם את מחשיבה את זה במדעי החברה, אז יש הרבה mechanisms, נראה לי שאפילו את אולי עוסקת ב-mechanism design או דברים כאלה, אבל בכל מקרה יש הרבה שיקולים של מנגנונים, ואולי גם קשרים סיבתיים, אז יש הרבה סכמות שגם חופפות בין מדעי החברה למדעי הטבע, רוח אולי זה סיפור קצת אחר, ואני לא יכול להגיד שאני מספיק בקיא בזה. בסדר?
כן, תודה.
Okay. So I want to kind of summarize the first part of this talk, where zooming out, we presented a new approach for information retrieval that's based on finding abstract semantic representations or schemas. Then, based on these schemas, we identify partial structural relationships, not going for full relationships like standard information retrieval, but explicitly looking for partial relations and distances along other aspects, and then leveraging this in applications to boost discovery. And that's what I meant by kind of general approach that applied across all the different domains. And now I want to also extend this to matching between authors. And authors are these complex objects with lots of different papers, lots of lines of work, collaborations that of course evolve over time. And we want to be able to match between authors so we can link you to people who can make you think of new ideas. And this is exactly what I'm going to show you now, work which is going to be presented at CHI, the HCI conference next year. So, this year, sorry. Okay, so our goal in this project is to connect scholars to peers who spark ideas for interesting research directions. And to unpack or unroll this a bit more, specifically, we're looking to help you find authors who make you think of new methods you can apply to your tasks, new tasks where your methods could be useful in, or new data sets you can explore for your work. Things that are both new and relevant. And to do this, I designed an approach based on something I call commonalities and contrasts, which again takes inspiration for what I presented in the first part. We want to find peers, authors, who share some common facets with you. For example, they work on similar problems. But we also want to find these peers who have contrasts along other dimensions, thinking of authors as this multi-dimensional object and looking for contrasts along other dimensions while having relevance along another subset. So for example, they may work on similar tasks, but use dissimilar methods. And this increases the chance that they will be novel and unfamiliar to you. So let's take, for example, an author. This is Dan. We automatically extract these facets we care about, like tasks, methods, and data sets from Dan's papers, again, using information extraction models. And based on this, we can now find authors who share commonalities, like similar items along one of these author dimensions. For example, similar tasks to Dan. And then we can also find the contrasts, dissimilar items along the other dimensions. So for example, methods that are different than what Dan normally uses. And we can take these methods and use them to inform Dan with potentially new ideas for his work. Now, this is an important technical note. These are not generic keywords taken from papers, but spans of text, raw spans of text extracted from papers. And it's actually highly non-trivial to measure similarity between these things or dissimilarity for that matter. So in this work, we used an approach that worked reasonably well empirically. We trained a neural language model on scientific texts, or rather we took a neural language model that was already trained on scientific texts, and then we fine-tuned it on all kinds of, was that a question? We then fine-tuned it on all kinds of semantic similarity tasks because the representations from these neural language models are not geared for measuring similarity between spans of text. But this, of course, is a partial solution. So in the third part of this talk, which is coming up in a few minutes, I'll show you a more principled, wholesome new setting that we propose to come up with this kind of similarity. So for now, just keep that in the back of your mind.
Sorry, so what's the supervision here? What are the labels?
In this paper?
What you just said, that the semantic similarity. You have supervision.
Oh, yeah. So this is based on external data sets for semantic similarity. This is far from the focus of our paper. We just take semantic similarity tests and we fine tune a model. But again, I'll show a more interesting and principled approach to it. Okay, so was that a question also? Or just, okay, sorry. Okay, so one key structural observation we make is that authors have many personas. They wear many hats. They work on different themes or different lines of work with different people, and we want to be able to capture this. So for example, Dan, one of his personas is more around natural language processing and language models, but then another persona is more around explainable AI and human-computer interaction. And these are two personas that we automatically extracted from Dan's papers by clustering his papers into these kind of cohesive subsets. And now taken together, this representation of an author can be thought of as a matrix, where the rows correspond to papers, the columns correspond to these facets we care about, the subsets of rows correspond to these personas or clusters of papers, and then the intersection of rows and columns can, for example, be all the tasks in a specific subset of papers. And given this representation, we can design an approach for author retrieval, where we take slices of these matrices for authors. We obtain all the spans of text, for example, mentioning tasks in a specific subset of your papers. We then embed all these tasks into a single vector representation that represents, for example, your tasks in a specific cluster of papers. And then we can use that to find authors who are similar to you along specific dimensions or dissimilar along other dimensions.
ננסה להבין מה הכוונה בטאסק. בסופו של דבר זה יהיה keyword, אתה רוצה, אתה לא באמת מבין כמה התכונה שלך מבינה מה זה סודו, המשמעות שלי מה זה סודו ג'נרטור ומה זה one function. יכול להיות construct keywords, נכון? אז החוכמה היא במה? החוכמה היא להצליח construct ה-keywords הנכונים, החוכמה היא אחר כך, אחרי שיצרת את המטה דאטה הזאת, לעבוד עם המטה דאטה, אתה רוצה להבין אתה לא בתחום שלי, אני רוצה אקסטרקט משהו לגבי מה שאתה עושה, ומנסה להבין איפה החלק האיכותי במשימה, האם עשית קיוורדס, האם אחרי שיצמת את המטריצה, לעשות איתה משהו.
כן, קודם כל יש הרבה חוכמות, החוכמה בעבודה הספציפית הזו היא באמת פחות ב-information extraction, שזה מה שהרגע אמרת, באיך להוציא אותה, אנחנו משתמשים בכלים קיימים, שאגב, פחות עובדים ברמה של keywords, אלא יותר ברמה של relations. כלומר, שאתה כותב שאני השתמשתי במשהו בשביל X, used for relations כאלה, אז אני יכול מזה להסיק מה הטאסק ומה המתוד.
זה ממש משינרי של NLP סטנדרטי?
כן, כן, כן.
זה לא תרומה שלכם, זה לוקח משהו סטנדרטי.
כן, כן, בטח. בעבודה הזו זה בעיקר עבודה של לתכנן ייצוג חדש לאותורס שימושים חדשים לייצוג הזה, לאפשר אינטראקציות חדשות עם איך שאתה בא באינטראקציה עם הספרות המדעית, או במקרה הזה עם חוקרים אחרים. וזה בדיוק שאני יכול להראות עכשיו.
הבנתי, סליחה שאני מספיק, ברגע שאתה את החלק הזה, אז כבר בחלק שאחרי שיצאת ייצור עתיד, אתה אומר, זו משימה נורא דומה למשימות שלך. יש מובן, מה זה הרוב, מה זה הווקטור, וזה, אבל...
כן, היא בהשראה למשימה הזו, So indeed, what we do is, based on this representation, we build a system where the system, which we call Bridger, helps you find authors who are similar to you along certain dimensions, but dissimilar along other dimensions. And then we show the system to 20 computer science researchers. We pull their papers from Semantic Scholar, which is a scientific search engine where I also work. It's part of the Allen Institute. And then as a baseline, we take a real-world applied baseline, which is the retrieval model used by Semantic Scholar to surface search results and surface recommendations. And we show participants in our studies these recommended authors recommended according to our approach and recommended according to standard information retrieval, which is state-of-the-art. And then different personas of authors will show different recommendations according to different interests and lines of work. Now we instruct, is that, I thought you were raising it, okay, multiple false positives. Okay, so we instruct participants in our studies to look at these authors and then check boxes corresponding to their papers or their tasks and methods that they consider as interesting for forming new and relevant research directions. And then we aggregate across the different conditions the proportion of these things measured for our approach and for the baseline. And the first key result we obtain is that 80% of researchers, who by the way span full computer science professors to graduate students, 80% of researchers preferred our approach that's based on commonalities and contrasts for discovering authors who are both relevant and spark new ideas for research in comparison to the standard state-of-the-art information approach. In addition, we also find that adding this representation of personas, finding those subsets of rows in that matrix, substantially boosts the preference of users for recovering recommended authors based on different lines of work and different interests. And finally, a result that I was happy to see is that when we conduct empirical analysis of our retrieved authors versus semantic scholars' retrieved authors, we find that ours are much more diverse and much more distant than the end user. So the plots you see here on the right are all kinds of distance measures between the end user and the recommended authors. For example, distances in terms of the citation graph, distances in terms of different publication venues, or in the co-authorship social network. And with our approach, we're able to retrieve authors who are much more distant than what standard search engines will show you, which is evidence that we're able to make progress in this challenging problem of helping bridge communities of diverse areas in science.
תום, אפשר שאלה?
כן.
כל הכלים האלה הם אופן סורס או שזה...
מה שאני מציג פה?
כן.
או הכלים שאני משתמש או הכלים שאני בונה?
בונה.
אז חלק אופן סורס וחלק עוד לא, פשוט כי זה פה הרבה הנדסה וזה מסובך לגרום לזה לעבוד. שחררנו את הקוד, אבל לא משהו שתוכל להשתמש בו. לא יודע אם אתה כולל את זה כאופן סורס או לא, אבל בוא נגיד זה סמי אופן סורס. אבל אנחנו עובדים על זה שזה יהיה לגמרי משהו שחוקרים יוכלו לקחת ולהמשיך את בניית המערכת הזו.
אוקיי, תודה.
יש לי גם שאלה. כל הכלים שאתה מתאר עכשיו, הכל מתבצע אוטומטית, או שגם יש שימוש crowd sourcing ובלייבר של אנשים?
לא, הכל אוטומטי. חוץ משלב של איסוף הנוטציות, שבמשימה הספציפית הזאת בכלל לא היה, זה הכל אוטומטי.
אוקיי, ועוד שאלה, כשאתה מדבר על השוואה למתודות, לכלים סטנדרטיים, אז למה אתה מתכוון? כי אני למשל מעולם לא ידעתי שיש כלי סטנדרטי לחפש authors שקרובים אליי, אז אני לא כל כך יודעת למה אתה מתכוון בהשוואה הזאת.
נכון, שאלה טובה. אז באמת, זה תחום שמאוד לא נחקר. בסמנטיק סקולר יש ייצוג למאמרים, שהוא כזה אומן כדי למצוא דמיון בין מאמרים ולאפשר חיפוש טוב, הוא מבוסס גם על הטקסט וגם על ציטוטים. במובן הזה זה הייצוג הכי מתקדם שאפשר למצוא כדי למדוד דמיונות בין מאמרים. וכדי למדוד דמיונות בין חוקרים, פשוט ממצאים עם כל מיני weighting של המאמרים השונים שלהם, נגיד על סמך מספר הציטוטים או עוד כל מיני שיקולים, כדי לקבל דמיון בין מאמרים בגישה הזו. הגישה הזו אבל לא מבוססת על למצוא דמיונות וקונטרסט. בעצם זה ההבדל המרכזי ביניהם. זה ברור?
אוקיי, ואז כשהצגתם את ה-80% improvement או מה שזה לא היה, אז בעצם נתתם לאנשים את התוצאות מהכלים הסטנדרטיים ואת התוצאות ושאלתם אותם מה אתם אוהבים יותר? זאת אומרת, על סמך מה זה ה-measure הזה?
כן, ה-measure הזה, כמו שאמרתי קודם, זה על סמך, ביקשנו מהם להסתכל על מאמרים ספציפיים של החוקרים האלה, על משימות ספציפיות, על בעיות ספציפיות, והם סימנו כל פעם שמשהו גרם להם לחשוב על כיוון חדש. אנחנו גם מראיינים אותם ושואלים אותם לעומק, מה בדיוק חשבתם וכן הלאה, לא נכנסתי לזה היום, אבל, ואז אנחנו בעצם מודדים כל מיני אגרגציות של ה-checkboxes האלה שהם סימנו, הפרופורציה שלהם נגיד בשיטה שלנו אל מול השיטה בבייסליין.
שאלה, זה נראה מאוד labor intensive, כמה אנשים היו מעורבים במשאלים האלו וכמה זמן הם עבדו בשביל לענות לך תשובות על השאלות שלך?
אז באמת לא היה קל למצוא את הזמן שלהם, הם היו 20 חוקרים, כמו שאמרתי, חלק פרופסורים וחלק דוקטורנטים, ושעה, עם כל אחד ישבנו שעה, כלומר לא הראינו להם הרבה מדי, אבל הם היו צריכים לעבוד קשה ויחסית מהר, כדי גם לסמלץ על איך שאנחנו כאנשים בוחנים מידע. אנחנו לא, בדרך כלל לא משקיעים יותר מדי כשאנחנו רואים איזה חוקר חדש או מאמר חדש כדי להחליט האם זה רלוונטי לנו או לא.
כן, הנושא של להיכנס לעומק של נושאים אחרים הוא לוקח קצת יותר מכמה דקות, אז זה די קשה לכמת דברים כאלו.
אז שאלה מעולה, באמת יש אחד מהדברים שאנחנו דנים בהם שם וחלק מהרעיונות שלנו, רעיונות באלף, זה הקושי שיש לנו כחוקרים להיכנס לתחום חדש. אנחנו הולכים ומתמקדים בתוך בועות קטנות כאלה, וכשמגיעה בועה חדשה, אנחנו לא יודעים בעצם חלק מהמשמעויות של השפה, כל מיני טרמינולוגיות, אז באמת זו בעיה מאוד קשה, שאני לא מתיימר לפתור אותה, אלא רק להתקדם בכיוון הזה. יש לנו גם כל מיני רעיונות לאיך להמשיך ולקדם את היכולת שלך, למדוד, לאמוד רלוונטיות של איזה קונספט חדש, כמה שיותר מהר, אבל בסוף אנחנו באיזה אקוסיסטם של צריכה מאוד מהירה של מידע, ואנחנו מתמודדים בתוך האקוסיסטם הזה. כלומר, זה מאוד applied ומבוסס על מה שקורה במציאות.
אפשר גם לשאול שאלה? שומעים אותי? כן, נראה לי זה גם כן כזה שאלת המשך, זאת אומרת, ברור שהדברים האלה הם כאלה מאוד מעוררי מחשבה ונראים חדשניים ואין כלים כאלה, אבל גם ב-general purpose, ה-mechanisms וה-purposes וגם עכשיו, זאת אומרת, עושים user study ומשווים שני כלים, כלי אחד הוא גרוע ואחד יותר טוב, אבל כאילו יש איזה דרך לדעת, כאילו, זאת אומרת, כדי שמישהו אשכרה ישתמש בזה, זה צריך להיות ממש טוב, זאת אומרת, יש איזה דרך להגיד, זה בכיוון, לא יודע, זאת אומרת, איך יודעים אבסולוטית, הדבר הזה הוא, בדברים האלה נראה שזה מאוד applied, המטרה היא שמישהו ישתמש בזה, זה איך יודעים במין user studies כאלה שהם, כאמור, קשה בדיוק להיכנס לנעלי היוזר האמיתי בעתיד, אם אנחנו בכלל קרובים לשם מהמרחק שנות אור, או שזה מעבר לפינה, לא יודע.
אז אני חושב שזה פשוט מוד שונה של מה מצופה מהיוזר. כלומר, אם היוזר מצפה לקבל דברים שהוא רגיל אליהם ומאוד רלוונטיים, כלומר, מה שבדרך כלל מתעסקים בו ב-Information Retrieval ובכלל בתחום שלנו, לאפטם עוד ועוד איזה פונקציית דיוק מסוימת ולקבל תוצאות עוד קצת יותר טובות, אז היוזר מתרגל לזה ומצפה לראות דברים כאלה. אני חושב שפה מדובר על מוד אחר שבו היוזר יכול להתרגל גם לקבל דברים שנראים על פניו פחות רלוונטיים במבט ראשון, ואז לשקול אותם שוב מחדש, ובהחלט צריך פה איזה טולרנס יותר גבוה לארור, כי אני לא חושב שהיכולות NLPים כרגע שם. מצד שני, חלק גדול מהדברים האלה, כשאנחנו משווים את זה נגיד למה שמקבלים במנוע חיפוש שהוא באמת עובד במציאות ונחשב טוב, או שאנחנו משווים למנועי חיפוש אחרים, כמו PubMed, כשאנחנו עושים מחקרים עם רופאים וביולוגים, אנחנו קונסיסטנטית רואים תוצאות הרבה יותר טובות בכל מיני מדדים של שימושיות וכן הלאה. אז אני חושב שיש פה איזה אזור ביניים כזה, שבו היוזר צריך להיות מורגל למוד חשיבה שונה של אקספלורציה, ובתוך המרחב הזה עדיין אפשר כבר לראות תוצאות שהן שימושיות, אבל ברור שיש עוד הרבה עבודה שצריך לעשות כדי ממש להגיע לזה.
יש לי שאלת המשך, עוד קצת אולי בכיוון של יונתן.
יכול להיות שלא נגיע פשוט לסוף, אבל מבחינתי זה בסדר.
זה עדיף לך בעיקרון.
אוקיי, בסדר גמור. לא, בסדר גמור. אוקיי. מה?
אז השאלה היא, זאת אומרת, משהו כמו קצת רוורס למה שאתה עושה. אתה אומר, בואו ניקח בן אדם ונמצא לו אנשים שדומים לו ושיכול לעשות איתם דברים. אני חושבת על כיוון קצת אחר, ונראה לי שהכלים שלך, תגיד לי אתה, יכולים לשמש להם באותו אופן, לקחת שני חוקרים ארביטרריים, ולהגיד להם, שני חוקרים נגיד שהם באמת מתחומים שונים, ולהגיד להם, הנה הנקודות שמחברות ביניכם, אם אתם רוצים לשתף פעולה, זה הנקודות שבהם אתם נגיד דומים ושונים, המתודות שלכם דומות, אבל אתם מסתכלים על דברים אחרים, או להפך, הדברים שאתם מסתכלים עליהם הם אותם דברים, ואז לנסות לעזור להם לחבר ביניהם, ומה שיש לי בראש זה, בקרוב הולך להיות איזשהו מפגש בין תחומי כזה, בין חוקרים, האם אתה יכול להתאים את הכלי שלך לדבר כזה שיעזור לאנשים מתחומים שונים, לחפש איזשהו מחקר חדש שיכול להיות מאוד חדשני ומעניין לשיתוף פעולה ביניהם.
כן, אז זה בדיוק מה שאנחנו עושים בעצם. כלומר, פחות נכנסתי לקרביים פה, אבל אנחנו מראים שיטות שכמה שיותר רלוונטיות לשיטות שלך, אבל בעיות מאוד שונות. או הפוך, בעיות מאוד דומות, אבל שיטות מאוד שונות. ויש לנו מדדים לדמיונות בין הדברים האלה, ככה שאנחנו בעצם מציפים את זה למשתמש. אנחנו גם מציפים את המאמרים שהם כמה שיותר דומים למאמרים שלך. שזה מין עוגן כזה להתחיל את ההיכרות עם מישהו חדש, דרך הדברים שכמה שיותר קרובים, ואז להתקדם הלאה לדברים שיותר רחוקים.
מדובר על אפליקציות חדשות, אז יש רושם שאותו דבר ממשיכים מחדש 17 פעמים ב-17 קבוצות שונות. השאלה אם זה גם כן משהו שאפשר לגלות, שבעצם כל אחד חוזר על עבודה שאחר עשה בצורה קצת שונה.
כן, בהחלט. אז באמת זו אחת הבעיות היסודיות שבהן התחלנו, ספציפית סביב COVID-19, שזה מאוד, הפוסט שלי תוך כדי זה, אז עבדנו בעולם הזה, ויש שם הרבה מאוד redundancy, ויש שם משמעויות, בוא נגיד, יותר הרות גורל מאשר בהרבה תחומים אחרים, ל-redundancy הזה, וכן, אני חושב שאפשר להשתמש בזה למטרות האלה. החלק השלישי של ההרצאה, שאני לא יודע כמה אני הולך להספיק ממנו, באמת מדבר על זה שיש שפה מאוד שונה בין קהילות שונות, אפילו אם הם עושים אותו הדבר. אז פיתחנו מודלים ואיזה setting חדש כזה ב-NLP, כדי בכלל לאפשר להתקדם במשימה המאוד מורכבת הזו של למצוא ששני קונספטים אומרים אותו הדבר למרות שהם בשפה שונה. אבל לגמרי.
זה נראה שם בזמן השאלות, נכון?
למרות שהשאלות הן מעורבות בתוך כדי הזה, אז...
רגע, צריך להחליט מה הוא...
בסדר, תחליט אותם.
זה לא טוב
שתעשה
10 דקות להגיד שאלות ולסיים.
נמנע בשאלות, כמה שזה קשה.
כן, אוקיי, זהו, יכול להיות שהייתי צריך לבסט את השאלות, אז בכל מקרה, אני אנסה לפחות לסיים את החלק השלישי, אוקיי. So, as I was just saying, it requires, to build these applications that we just discussed, it requires linking mentions of scientific concepts across many papers. For example, in this problem of author matching that we just discussed, we can take two authors, we use information extraction approaches to obtain all their methods, tasks, and data sets as I described, and now we want to match between them, but we quickly run into some fundamental problems in language. First, we have diversity. Two different communities or different authors can refer to the same thing, like false positives, for example, or type 1 errors, with very different language because they work in different spaces. We also have the problem of ambiguity. Network architecture in systems and network architecture in deep learning mean very different things, although they have the exact same lexical form. And then we have hierarchy, all these fine-grained levels of resolution you see in scientific discourse and scientific reasoning. And we'd like to be able to make these connections so we can match between authors more accurately. Now, in previous work, the kind of closest related is an NLP in a task called cross-document coreference resolution, where in this task, basically, the goal is to take mentions of things like people or places in the news and identify if they refer to the same underlying entity like Obama in two different news reports. But this work did not look at all in the scientific domain or abstract technical concepts, despite their prevalence and importance in technology and science, and also despite their intricate challenges and difficulties that they introduced, like, for example, all these fine-grained levels of resolution in the technical language. Another key limitation of this work is that it ignored the notion of hierarchy between concepts mentioned in two different papers, or different texts for that matter. So having observed these applications I've been building over the past few years, I also wanted to build a task that can address cross-document ambiguity, diversity, and hierarchy, these three challenges, together. And in this task, the input is mentions of concepts in scientific papers, for example, self-driving cars, autonomous vehicles, and their surrounding text. And then our first goal is to output these clusters. For example, putting self-driving cars and autonomous vehicles together in the same cluster. And then we also want to identify hierarchy between clusters. For example, putting image synthesis and generation of images together in the same cluster as a child of a more general cluster of computer vision. A bit more formally, in this task, we're given a set of documents. Each document has mention spans annotated within them. For example, these names of tasks or concepts like self-driving cars. Now let's take all these mentions across all our documents in our corpus and unroll them. Our first goal is cross-document clustering, where we want to cluster all these mentions into disjoint subsets across multiple papers, each subset consisting of mentions of the same underlying concept. For example, self-driving cars and autonomous vehicles. Secondly, we define a graph over vertices that represent the clusters, these sets of textual mentions and their context. And the edges in this graph are directed edges that reflect hierarchical relations between cluster I and cluster J. And specifically, the notion of hierarchy that we define and introduce in this paper is something we call a referential hierarchy, where simply put, a relation between a cluster I and cluster J exists when the concept that underlies cluster J entails a reference to cluster I. So, for example, if in your paper you're referring to BERT or bidirectional transformers, these neural models, you're also implicitly invoking a reference to the more general parent concept of neural language models, even if you didn't explicitly write that in your text. So taken together, our task is called hierarchical cross-document coreference. We're given documents and mentions within them. Our goal is to construct these clusters and a hierarchy graph defined over these clusters by learning from a set of examples that are annotated according to the structure given to us during training time. So this is a supervised task. And in this task, because it's new, we also need to collect a new data set and new metrics for evaluation. But there are some core challenges for annotating this kind of data. First is a huge number of papers that we work with. So just randomly sampling pairs of papers to show annotators is not going to lead with high enough probability to mentions of concepts that are related to each other. And secondly, the task is just inherently complex. It requires a lot of expertise and effort to read these kind of things. So we devise a kind of distance supervision-based scheme for bootstrapping the collection of our data. And I'm not going to go into all the different details here, but these are the core two messages. First, we can use external sources of information to extract candidates that are going to be related with sufficiently high probability to bootstrap our collection of data. So for example, we can go to all kinds of curated AI ontologies, for example, telling us about tasks in NLP and subtasks, like question answering and all kinds of subtasks of question answering. And these, assuming that the ontology is accurately constructed, are going to be related with high probability. So we can now go back to the literature. We can retrieve mentions of these concepts, the parent concept and its child concepts. We can retrieve these in the literature and then show these together to expert annotators. And now, in this study, annotators were not crowdsourced. They were PhD graduate students or full PhDs with a few papers. And they annotated these mentions by using a interface that we built specifically for this task, where you can merge mentions into clusters and then kind of drag and drop clusters to build the hierarchy over them. Now, using this process, we created a data set which we call SCICO, for Scientific Concept Induction Corpus. And one of the things to note about this data set is that it's substantially larger than the main current benchmark people use in the general domain for cross-document coreference resolution. Now, another thing that we needed to introduce in this paper, which I'm not going to discuss in detail in the interest of time, is new evaluation metrics, specifically measuring for discrepancy or alignment between two structures of graphs over clusters. We do this so we can measure annotation accuracy or annotator agreement, and more details about the specific measures we built are in the paper. Now, finally, I'll just take a few minutes to show you some custom baseline models we built for this task. The first kind of family of baselines involves two steps. First, learning the clusters, then learning the hierarchy over the clusters. Now, to learn the clusters, we take a existing cross-document coreference model. We train it on our specific data set, and then we obtain the clusters using this model. So the interesting thing to ask in this baseline is, how do we infer the hierarchy between clusters? And to do this, we go back to a fundamental task in natural language processing that's called textual entailment or natural language inference. We're given some text, we need to identify whether it entails some other text. Given the text, identify if it entails the hypothesis. Like, for example, if you have a text that says that Peter is snoring, this also entails a more general statement that a man sleeps. And we developed the intuition that our notion of referential hierarchy is in itself a type of entailment. So, for example, if in your paper you're referring to drug-drug interaction extraction, you're also implicitly entailing a reference to the more general concept of information extraction. And equipped with this intuition, we can now simply take our clusters, take all the mentions within the clusters kind of unrolled into one long string, and then we apply a pre-trained natural language inference or entailment model to predict these entailment relations between clusters. And this works okay for a lot of the more simple cases, but fails for a lot of the richer ones. And observing some of the failure modes, we notice that you often need to make subtle decisions between hierarchy and coreference at the mention pairwise level. So for example, if you prepend the word artificial before neural network, you still remain within the neural network concept in computer science. But if you add the word definition before extraction, you're now a child concept of the more general information extraction. So we wanted to give the model a more fine-grained, higher resolution ability to separate between these two different types of relations. And we did this with a multi-class formulation where we take pairs of mentions, M1 and M2, like self-driving cars and autonomous vehicles, or definition extraction and information extraction. And we classify them into these four classes, either being co-referring, hierarchy in either direction, or just no relation. We do this by passing them into some function f that outputs scores corresponding to each one of these classes. And then we optimize the standard cross-entropy loss. Now, what is this function f? Without going into too many details, the main approach is something called cross-encoding in language models, which some of you have obviously heard of. But if you haven't, what it basically means is, let's take our two mentions, like definition extraction and information extraction. Let's take all their surrounding text. Now let's encode them together in some neural language model that can attend simultaneously to different parts of both texts corresponding to both mentions. And then to leverage wide context that you often see as important in scientific papers like paragraph level context, we also use recent approaches for working with longer sequences developed at AI2 and Semantic Scholar. Finally, in terms of inference, we first want to build the clusters. So we take our pairwise mention level scores for coreference, the probability that two mentions are co-referring. We look at this as a kind of similarity matrix that we feed into agglomerative clustering to build the clusters. And then to infer the hierarchy, we're looking for some score or probability measure that one cluster is a child of another. So we look at all the cross-cluster pairwise predictions for the is-child relationship. And then we simply aggregate all these pairwise predictions into a measure of probability that one cluster is a child of the other. And then finally, we perform greedy construction because we want to avoid cycles. So we start with the highest probability link between two clusters and iterate. Now, two main things about the results, and this is the last slide for this part. First, we see that using this family of existing models in 2 steps substantially underperforms our multi-class cross-encoder that directly learns to distinguish between coreference and hierarchy at the mention level. But secondly, and much more importantly, we see a lot of potential room for model improvement versus human performance, expert human performance on this task. For example, we see all kinds of core false negatives like type 1 error and false positives missed. Or we see all kinds of interesting extra links added, like kernel in operating systems and kernel in machine learning, not referring to the same thing, but the model does not currently identify that. And of course, our data set and models are all on Hugging Face, the leading platform, if you haven't heard of it, for sharing models and data sets, and you can work on it there. Okay, I don't know if I'm going to have time for this. Do you want me to compress it into 1 minute or with a compression? Yes, okay. So here are, broadly speaking, the 4 different things that I'm interested in identifying gaps in science and generating hypotheses, in automatically retrieving literature to help scientists and medical researchers make decisions, in building new interfaces for search and exploration in science, and also machine learning models for scientific literature. And I've been making all kinds of progress across these different paths. I wanted to share with you some new models that we built, either published or under review, for using all kinds of naturally occurring supervision signals that appear in the literature for all kinds of learning tasks. And in the interest of time, I'm going to show you only one kind of intuitive example, where a lot of tasks that we are interested in involve finding all kinds of similar aspects between papers. For example, similar methodologies or similar experiment designs. But it's very hard to collect labels for this kind of problem. So we developed the intuition that there's a natural source of supervision in the form of co-citation sentences. These sentences that cite 2 papers together, and they often tell you a kind of explanation why 2 papers are related, along what dimensions or what aspects. And then we developed a model that uses optimal transport for sparse matching between different sentences and different papers. And we learn it by using this naturally occurring form of supervision, using the text to guide the model to learn this a spectral similarity. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to skip a lot of the things I'm interested in, and I'll just wrap up with the kind of fundamental problem that I'm interested in that goes back, that all this work goes back to, which is helping people in science or in medicine, engineering, tap into scientific knowledge much better than what we currently do to help throughout all different parts of our workflow, from creating ideas, from reviewing the literature, to making decisions. And I do this by developing new approaches for harnessing humankind's collective scientific knowledge. And today I presented some core contributions based on analogies for finding abstractions that can help us boost creativity, commonalities and contrasts between authors, fundamental challenges in NLP for linking across the literature, and also very briefly, we also saw some new models. I'd like to thank a lot of the great institutions that I worked with and my collaborators there, specifically AI2, UW, and also CMU, where we had a lot of collaborations. Of course, to Daphna, my PhD advisor at Hebrew University, to Dan, my postdoc host, and to Eric from Microsoft, who also acted as a kind of host. Student interns and people who worked with me over the past few years. Of course, many thanks to them too. And that's it. I would say I'm happy to take any remaining questions, but I think we're a lot over time. Also, there were tons of questions throughout, so I'm happy to take any questions in any case.
Thank you. Okay, bוא נסיים.
That's
בסדר. צריך ללמוד. כן, זה שיש שאלות.